Today we have a PlayStation 5 that has a broken HDMI port, which is really common with these. Most of these PS5s are also fairly dirty right next to the fan. Yep. So, nothing out of the ordinary there. It's never been opened before. That's a good sign. The repair attempts by other shops that I inevitably have to fix are pretty annoying. So the fact that we get a fixed one that's been unopened is great. We're just going to go ahead and open it up. This is my favorite console to work on. So there's the Xbox Series S, which is also another one of my favorites to work on. It's small, compact, easy to take apart, easy to put back together. The HDMI port on Xbox Series S is a little bit harder to get off, but that's okay. Okay, it looks like this PlayStation was dropped. The fan is bowed up right here. Most of the time that's what the reason is for the HDMI port breaking. PS5s stand up straight, and because of that, they can get knocked over really easily. We always got to check a couple of things here. So the fan connector is good. Alright, we're gonna take off the warranty seal there. Fun fact is that warranty seals are actually illegal, and they've been illegal since I think the 70s, possibly, but companies still use them so they can justify not fixing anything, because with consumer products they made it to where you should be able to work on your own things. Obviously there's certain circumstances that they shouldn't work on stuff, which is when people don't know what they're doing and completely break something. But again, you know, people are supposed to be able to work on things that they buy, and if you offer a warranty, then your warranty should be covered at all times. So we're just gonna take these guys out here. Hang on just a minute. Alright, so I had a spam caller, which happens quite often, even though I'm a business, which is pretty annoying. Alright, so there's a split right here. So obviously this thing was dropped. Hopefully there's not going to be too much damage inside of here. Doesn't look like there is, and this also looks like it's a newer model of the PS5. Seeing how the heat sink is literally as small as it can be. Sony was thinking, hey, I got a good idea. The PS5 has extreme overheating options, so let's go ahead and make the heat sink smaller, right? But they claim that they make the heat sink smaller because it saves power, less power consumption. Which I guess is good in some cases, but in most cases, PS5s do have overheating. And a lot of times, the reason why is the liquid metal that they use. So, people have issues with PS5s and how they basically just shut off when playing PS5 version games, such as 2K, such as Elden Ring, Pretty much any of those big games that are PS5 labeled games, they are the ones that cause the system to turn off and overheat. However, I found a fix for that. There is other videos that show you about the setting aspect of it, and changing those certain settings inside of your PlayStation 5 will also help with that issue. But in order to make sure it doesn't come back for a long time, or at all in some cases, you have to open up the PlayStation 5, and there's a little trick you can do with the liquid thermal inside of it to stop it from overheating. And I will show you what the liquid metal looks like inside of here once I get the 8 million screws out that are in here. Now it is kind of nice because there's only, let's see, 3 screws you have to take out to get this apart, like 3 small Phillips screws. One was the cover that goes over the SSD you can put inside of here. The other is, of course, this character right here. And the rest of them are all just T9. And they're all fairly easy to take out. I've only had a couple of instances where these screws right here, the factory had screwed them in too tight, and so they try to strip out whenever you try to unscrew them. So I've had to use pliers to get these out before. That's okay. Alright, now that we have that off, you gotta take this big old ribbon right here, and then you can just lift up on the board. Sometimes this screw here with the spacer under it, sometimes you have to loosen that in order to get this up because it'll be sitting over the board. In this case it's not doing that, so we're just going to lift up, and as we lift up we're going to use a pair of tweezers to pry up in certain areas. Now you don't want to pry under the green areas because there are components under there, so you just pry underneath the copper area here and it'll just pop out right there where the power supply is. And this is the liquid thermal I was talking about here. You can see how there's a bare spot. I don't know if you can see that very well, but there's a bare spot in the middle, and same with right here, there's a bare spot right there in the middle, and that's what causes the infamous overheating issue. And you could spread it back out, the liquid thermal, to cover that, but most of the time you have to take all of that off, and you have to clean the entire area off with alcohol and then apply new liquid thermal to both the APU and the frame, which will stop that from happening. But in this case, there's no overheating with this PS5, so all we need to do is just spread it out again, which will be simple enough. And there's the broken port there. We always got to make sure we take this little foam piece off here, because we don't want to suffocate ourselves and put toxic stuff in our lungs. So let's get that removed and put a new one on there. Alright, we got to get a bunch of flux on the back of this port. Once we have enough flux behind there, we're going to go ahead and heat it up. I already took the little foam piece underneath the port off. We're just going to heat that up till we can get some solder inside of those feet. With the PS5, it's not necessary to add my own solder into it, as they come off pretty easily. However, I do it anyways. It just makes it a lot easier to suck the solder out of the feet holes there. And it also just speeds up the process a little bit. You want to be careful when you add flux, because once you heat it up, it can drip like this, and when it does, it burns you. I have plenty of scorch marks on my hands from flux doing that. It'd probably be beneficial to actually wear gloves. Haven't really thought about that, but because I tend to do it all the time. I don't know if you saw that, but some just fell on me. But that's okay. Builds character, right? Alright, add some flux there. Or not flux, solder. Add some solder over here. Looks like this one's going to come off pretty easy, which is nice. A lot of times when this metal frame right here gets bent, it gets hard to take these off, and sometimes you have to pry them together. Yeah, we might have to pry this one together because it's split so far apart that it pushes against the outside here. Oh, no. Alright, well, it's just going to come off, but in some cases, that does push against the sides really hard. And you have to squeeze it together with a pair of pliers or something. Now, if you choose to suck the holes out like I just did, you gotta be really careful because there's that capacitor right behind the pads, which I'll show you a close-up of. If you suck that up, you will have to replace it. You could also bridge the connections, but I'd rather do it the right way and put a whole new capacitor on there. So I'll go ahead and show you a close-up of that. Alright, so we have a bunch of flux on here, but even though all that flux is on there, you can still see those pads there that don't have very much solder on them, like this one, and this one. See how they look more flat and the other ones look more rounded? That shows you that the port was disconnected from those pads. We're gonna go ahead and throw some new solder on there, clean this area up from all this debris right here, and once we do that, we'll be able to throw a new port on. Alright, I put some more flux on those pads, that way that this solder will go on really well. And you just have to, sometimes when those pads lose all the solder, like those two that we saw, you have to hold the heat on it just a little bit longer with your soldering iron. However, this one didn't take too long, and now that those pads are shiny, we're going to go ahead and get a new port here. And after we get this, we're going to put some flux on the back of it. And we're going to go ahead and tin the pins on the back of the port here. So this is the port, and these are the pins right here. They're all copper colored, and we need to put solder on there to make them like shiny silver. You want it to be a shiny silver. So I use a ton of flux. The only reason I do that is because it makes things a lot easier. So we're going to go ahead and clean off the soldering iron. You just want it to be a nice shiny area there, and the little bit of solder that is on the iron will take to those copper pieces really well, especially if you use a lot of flux. And depending on how much solder you have on your iron, it will. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can make it to where these pads have basically a mound of solder on them, individually of course, and adhere the port to it, and put very little solder on the pins on the back of the port. I do it either way. I found that all the ways that you do this are right, as long as it sits right and gets on, the pins get adhered to the pads really well. However, if you don't put enough solder on the pads and the port, when you go to heat this up and put it on here, it will make a connection, but the connection may be really bad, and over time the pins from the port will lift off of the pads and disconnect the HDMI from heat of the board. So that's why I put a bunch of solder on there, that way that it sticks nice and it'll last. We're just gonna heat this up, and once it heats up, those pins will sit on those pads perfectly. They'll sit flush, and you want it to where the solder from the pads and the solder from the pins on the back of the port both turn into a fluid, that way that they connect together. And that's why we pre-tin the port, is so that those pins do sit on the pads nice. So I can usually just push the port forward, and when I do that, I can see that the solder has melted, which it has. We're just going to go ahead and put some pressure on the back of it and take the heat away. And you'll tell that it's cooled down enough to handle it and move it when the solder goes from a shiny silver to like a matte gray color. Now we're going to flip the board over, and we're going to go ahead and add some solder to the feet so that we can push that up with the heat. Should have been a wrapper. Heat, feet. Sometimes if the solder doesn't stick, what we'll have to do is we'll have to scratch it around the feet to get some copper showing. However, it looks like it's doing just fine here. We're going to flip that back over, and we're going to heat it back up and push that solder through the feet holes. Now there will be a gap between the feet and the hole there that's dark, and you just want to watch it as you heat this up, because there will be a shiny silver that pushes through and it almost creates like a mound under there, and that's what you're looking for. Most of the time the back one takes a lot faster than the front one, and it looks like both of those have taken already. It's not a lengthy process. It does it pretty quick because this board is so thin. And once the solder pushes through all those holes, what I like to do is just make sure that those pins are still secured. Alright, now we have the port on there. We're going to go ahead and let the board cool down. As it cools down, what I like to do is go back to the frame and move the liquid metal back onto the center of the frame. Before I do that, I'm just going to take some alcohol here and clean this area off. Get all that flux off of there. Alright, and now we're going to go ahead and move that liquid thermal over there on the frame, and then we'll do the same thing for the APU here. Alright, I use a syringe for this, and this actually came from Conductonaut. I have had the order from them before to get liquid metal, but as you can see here, it just sucks up nicely, and you can just place it wherever you want, which is really nice. Well, like I said, this one hasn't had any overheating problems yet. It will eventually, as all of them will. But we're going to go ahead and spread that out, and you just want to lightly go over the top of it. You don't want to push down because it will create bare spots, and you will have that same metal to metal contact that creates all that issue. So we're just going to spread it out here until it looks like it's covered most of the area with that liquid. And that's fairly good on its own. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing to the APU, and then we'll get this thing put back together. Alright, so now that we got it spread out here on the APU as well, it's not perfect obviously, but it doesn't need to be in this case. Here is the new HDMI port here. So as we can see, it's stuck on there nice. We're going to go ahead and put this together now. You never want to get that liquid thermal or the liquid metal. You don't want to get that on the motherboard anywhere. If it is on the motherboard, you will have to take alcohol and wipe it off, and the reason for that is it will short out components on the board. So you gotta be really careful when you work with it. We're just gonna get these ribbons plugged in here. Now those are plugged in, we're going to secure the board. I always like to make sure it's cooled down enough, which it has. And we're just going to go ahead and screw these on. You don't want to torque these down too hard, but at the same time you want to make sure that it is secured. And just go to where it stops, and like so, where the resistance is there. You don't want to torque past the resistance. Now what we're going to do is we're going to throw a couple of screws in. We're going to throw one in right here by the port, because we don't want the port to move when we test it. And we're going to throw one right here, one up here, and then one right here. And the reason why I do that is because it secures all the points here. So now the board is actually secured down. We're going to go ahead and throw these antennas back on here. There's a couple different setups inside of these PS5s. Some of them have more antennas that come through here, and they'll be black and white instead of blue and white. However, on this case, we have just the blue and white. We're going to secure those down. We got to secure them down to where they're out of the way of the disk drive, because if you don't, the disk drive won't sit right when you put it all the way back together, and the customer won't be able to, or yourself if you're fixing your own, won't be able to pull discs in and out of the drive. Okay, so that's sitting there nice, and we're just going to plug this ribbon back in here. Alright, now that we got that in, we're going to go ahead and throw the cover on. Once we have that cover on, of course there's still that split there, which doesn't look too bad. Let me take this real quick. Alright, now that we have that plastic piece on there, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to straighten this frame out for the fan. Alright, that looks pretty good. We're just going to throw that in there. Yeah, it definitely sits better now. We just got to make sure the fan still spins when secured, which it does. Alright, we're going to plug that in. We're going to plug this cable in here. And now we can go ahead and test it like this. You just want to make sure you hold it flat when you test it, because you don't want to stand it up straight, as everything will fall out and probably break your system even more. Alright, let's go test it. Alright, so we have it plugged in here. Still showing no signal. So I'm going to jimmy it around a little bit, because I think some flux might be stuck in the port, and that might be the issue. We'll check it out. Okay, so that's exactly what the issue is. Since I use so much flux, what I have to do is I'll plug the HDMI cable in one time, and I'll take it back out, and I wipe the flux off, because this will pull all the flux out. And now it's good to go. So let's get that thing put back together. Let's take the fan out. Then we'll take this cable out. And since we didn't screw any of these in, we can just pop this bad boy off. Maybe. Sometimes they get caught, you just gotta shake it a little bit. And we're going to disconnect the disk drive and pop that off. Now we can put all the 180 million screws back in. Now this is the good part about using a drill. Some people have like a cool little, like, it's like a electrical pin that does the same thing. However, I'm old school and tend to use a drill instead. We're going to put each one of these in here, and once we get all these put in, we can connect everything back together. I'm going to go ahead and grab a brush and clean this little area out here too, as PS5s are extremely sensitive in every way possible. Such as dust in there and stuff like that can cause serious overheating, and we don't want that to happen. I will say this from working on PS5s. Sometimes when the HDMI port isn't working, customers will call me and they'll bring in their PlayStation 5, and like, let's say it was storming or something the day before, and like the power went out, or there was like power surges or something like that. I'll get a bunch of calls afterwards, and people will say, you know, my HDMI port isn't working, and they bring it in and the port looks just fine. And I open up the console. What'll happen is the Ethernet, which is right here, the coil on it will short out. If you use Ethernet instead of Wi-Fi and you have the Ethernet plugged up, and the power surges or anything like that, it'll short out the Ethernet port there, and it'll short that out. And when it shorts that out, it can do multiple things. So it can short out the power supply and the HDMI as well when the Ethernet shorts out. So I do not recommend using the Ethernet port. Some people like using the Ethernet port, which is okay, but like, let's say it's storming or something like that, unplug your Ethernet and just use Wi-Fi during that. Also, you don't want to plug your PS5, you don't want to plug any game console into a surge protector. You want to plug it straight into the wall. Reason for that is, if you have it plugged into a surge protector, it will kill your system. And this is from experience. Every time a customer calls me and asks you know, do you work on power issues with PS5s, PS4s, Xboxes, any of that stuff? I say yes. And I always ask them, was it plugged into a surge protector? And all of them were. Every single one of them. So don't plug it into a surge protector, plug it straight into the wall. That's how I've had mine plugged in, and it's been through power surges, you know, power being cut off, storms, etc. And I've never had problems with my console. Another thing is rest mode on PS5. Don't let it go into rest mode. 90% of the problems that aren't physically related inside of the PS5 are because the PS5 was in rest mode. And that also comes with the extreme overheating that you experience with the PS5 is because you're putting in a rest mode. I always tell customers turn rest mode off. That's one of the settings that I would change. And you will have to turn your console off every night so you can't fall asleep watching Netflix. Instead, you're going to have to turn your PlayStation 5 off. Which is kind of inconvenient, but at the same time, if you like your PlayStation 5 and you don't want it to die, that's a necessary thing to do. So, I got all the screws put into place, and I know which ones to skip because obviously I've worked on these quite a bit. These ones are for the fan here. Frame. That's the plastic frame up there. So we're going to go ahead and throw the disc drive on here. And this doesn't secure with any screws at this point until you put the frame on, because the frame actually screws in right here, and right here. As you will see here, you can line it up with the holes. And I don't take the screws out of this because it's inconvenient. It's not very time savvy to take those out. So we're going to get all these screws in here. And it's actually sitting really nice. So maybe it just popped out when it was dropped. This front piece right here, maybe it just popped out when it was dropped, because now it's sitting in there nice and flush, which is good. Most of the time that could be fixed by screwing that in. We're going to go ahead and clean this out real quick. Just going to take a brush and brush it out into the trash can, because we don't want any of that dust to cause issues in the future. Alright. Now that we got that dust out of there, we can go ahead and put the fan back in, and I've already dusted the fan off. And since we bent the frame back on the fan, it spins perfectly, works perfectly, and it sits flush. These 2 points here are kind of lifted up, but that's okay, because when we put this on here and screw it down, those will push down, and it's not going to bend up anywhere else. It'll sit flush. We're going to get that plugged in. We're going to plug this cable in. And we're just going to feed this cable through the plastic tabs here, which you just pop in there just like that. Once we have those in there, and these wires here pushed down and tucked under this plastic tab right here, we can go ahead and put the sticky pad back on. Flush, just like that. It's one of the most satisfying things. We can go ahead and put the fan frame or fan cover on here. And we have 2 machine screws which go at the bottom, and then you have one long plastic screw and one short plastic screw. It doesn't mean the screws are plastic, it means they screw into plastic. They are metal screws that screw into plastic. Okay, we're gonna take that back up. So yeah, it looks like we have an issue here with this guy, which is all right. We'll just bend it. Looks like it wants to come up, so we're gonna go ahead and bend that back here. Get that pushed down if we can. Yep, we're gonna screw that one in first. Alright, now that we have that one screwed in, we'll be able to screw in all the other ones. So now we're gonna screw the short one, because it's directly across the way. And let's make sure it still spins. Yep. Screw that guy down, no bending at all on here, which is really nice, and the fan spins great. Alright, let's get this cover back on here, and we're going to screw that guy down. Alright, and once we have that screwed down, we're going to go ahead and brush this off real quick. Get all that crap out of there, and now we can just pop this in right here, and then we just push down. Simple as that. I'm going to go ahead and brush this off as well. Now that we have that brushed off, we can go ahead and it just sits, so you'll feel the pins cause resistance when you just sit it on there. You just want to sit on there lightly. Once you feel the top of that resistance, you just give it a little bump, and it's on there. And there is the new port installed. Looks good. Looks like a brand new PS5 again. Alright, let's test it out one last time and we'll call the customer. Alright, now that we got it put all back together here, we got it plugged up. Comes up just like that. That's what we're talking about right there. Reaper's Electronics does it best, people. Come on now.